Hello. So today I wanted to talk about Kropotkin. He was a Russian prince and an anarchist later on in life, born in 1842 and died in 1921. He was born in Russia, and he died in Russia, but in the middle many things happened that took him out of Europe, out of Russia, out of Asia actually, and got him to reside in Europe on and off as an exiled. Kropotkin, as I mentioned earlier, was descended from an ancient line of Russian princes, and he had a direct line to the throne of the Tsars. So the fact that he became an anarchist later is interesting, to say the least. Initially, he was influenced by liberal ideas, and he became a Cossack, so that was a cavalryman of noble origin, and moved to Siberia, where he studied and was in touch with the penal system, with the justice system, and he was horrified by what he saw happening in Siberia to people who were sent to jail or were exiled. So this kind of jolted him a little bit out of his liberal ideas, which were already too advanced for a noble Russian prince. But when he read Joseph Proudhon, the first thinker that we identify as an anarchist, he became very radicalized, and that was in 1865. A year later, he resigns from the Cossacks because he didn't agree with the way that prisoners were executed in Siberia. And because he was a nobleman and didn't need an income, he became a geographer with the Russian Geographical Society. But a year later, he reads Bakunin, he starts meeting with Russian exiles, and ends up declaring himself an anarchist and starts writing along the lines of anarchism, which at the time was prominently advocating in Russia to depose the Tsar. The Tsar was the king of Russia, or the emperor of Russia, if we want to put it in those terms, and he had a bloody policy towards peasants and workers. So the anarchists and many others were really into organizing to get rid of his figure. When he started writing against the Tsar, he was arrested and escaped from Siberia 2 years later, and he went to France, where he founded a newspaper, but was very soon arrested also for anarchist organizing, and he ended up in London, just like Marx had done earlier, a very similar detour to that Marx had to take after he engages in the support of revolutions in 1848. So we are going to read a little ahead of time here. We are going to start reading Kropotkin before we read Marx, although Marx was actually writing a little ahead of time, because Kropotkin has a very clear and very direct criticism of the social contract. And since we started our classes on liberalism talking about the social contract, I thought it would be good to bring the workers' perspective of a critique to the social contract, as we did last week, bringing the Latin American, the global South perspective on the social contract. So in London, he starts writing his most important books, but in 1917, when the Tsar is deposed, he arrives to what's still Russia right before the Bolshevik Revolution. As we will study later in the semester, the Bolshevik Revolution happens a few months after the Tsar is deposed by a group of Democrats, radical Democrats. So Kropotkin arrives in Russia in between the fall of the Tsar and the uprising, mostly organized by the Bolsheviks, with support, obviously, of the anarchists and many others. When the Bolshevik Revolution happens in October 1917, as an anarchist, Kropotkin is disgusted by their methodologies. He's against the centralization of the economy. He's against the brutality through which the Bolsheviks are advancing their cause. and he retires from public lives and just writes denouncing the Bolshevik dictatorship. He died shortly after in 1921, and his funeral becomes a huge anti-Bolshevik demonstration. So one of Kropotkin's main ideas derives from both anarchism and also upheld by Marxism, is that everywhere, he says, you will find that the wealth of the wealthy springs from the poverty of the poor. This is quite different of this idea of linking freedom with the possibility of making money that was the engine behind these ideas of liberalism, especially in Locke's version of liberalism. Here, Kropotkin is telling us that if somebody's wealthy, it's because they've been exploiting the poor. No other reason. So he comes up with his own version of what anarchism is, and he calls it anarcho-communism. And there are many different ways of understanding anarchism. Kropotkin is one of the most well-known ones, and it's based on the idea that what moves humankind, what makes us be a better society, what makes us advance, whatever we understand by that, is mutual aid. It's the idea that we humans, just like the animals that he observed when he was devoting his life to being a scientist, we do better when we cooperate with each other than when we compete with each other. As you know, competition is at the basis of liberalism, the idea that we level the field, we give everybody the same opportunities, and then we compete against each other, and the best will win. Anarcho-communism says that this is exactly the opposite of how humankind should evolve, that humankind should be evolving rather through cooperating and aiding each other rather than competing against each other. Because, according to the anarchists, especially Kropotkin, we are naturally sociable. Government is not necessary for us. If you can give us a non-government way of connecting with each other, of building a community, then the good that we are will arise. On the other hand, he thinks that private property and inequality of income would give place to the free distribution of goods and services. So instead of having the kind of society where we have now, that if you want something, you have to fight for it, compete with others over it, and then privatize whatever you get out of that exchange and try to make more money than anybody else in your social circles to feel successful and a good provider if you have a family, or successful and happy if you're single, then this idea for Kropotkin is not really going to work out, because we are naturally sociable and all the human ails that we have are the result of this competition, inequality, insecurity. So instead of private property and inequality of income, he would like to have free distribution of goods and services. That is, in Kropotkin society, you take what you need and you give what you can. Workers would have access to goods and services to cover their needs through what he called a free distribution warehouse. So there would be a space, a physical and a discursive space for people to get their needs covered and for people to contribute to the extent that they are able to. So very different from other theories where what we usually see is prizes for those who are better than others. So big differences with liberals. For Kropotkin, the state is not a space for the common good. The state rather is an institution that protects private property and those who hold private property. And again, here I'm going to go back to some of the things that we've said in the past in class. Private property is not the same for every one of these authors. For Marx, we will see that private property only matters when it's something that you can reproduce and that you can have people work for you in order to make that happen. So if I have 10 houses and I rent 9 of them, those 9 houses are private property. But the one that I have for myself is just my own home. That's not considered for Marx private property. But in the case of the anarchists, and particularly Kropotkin, private property is anything that you can say, this is mine, and that you don't share with anybody else. So your home, your car, your garden, all of those would be your private property. And he's not so much concerned with the small private property. He's also concerned with the bigger picture private property, the factories, big chunks of land, etc. And he thinks that the state was created, that we came out of the the so-called state of nature, so that there would be an authority that would protect our capacity to produce private property and to keep it. So we could think that the police is there to protect the owners of the factories if the workers uprise, which sometimes happen. And we many times see the police protecting the assets of the wealthy. We can think that the police is there to protect the banks that have accumulated the money that was taken away from working people by those who hold property. All of those would be examples of why the state is there and what the state is doing. So for him, they're not protecting people, they are protecting the property of those who hold it. He also thinks that the social contract does not protect the poor and that the poor were not asked to sign it. This is very important. Kropotkin holds a vision similar to Marx, through which poor people have been exploited for generations since the days of slavery, going through medieval ages, the serfs that were tied to the land and had to work for the Lord, to today, where capitalists can hire and fire you at will as long as they pay you a salary as when you are working. Very different from slavery, very different from serfdom, but still you are working for somebody else, and the most that you produce is taken by this property owner, and you don't take it home. You only take home a little bit that allows you to reproduce your life. So because he thinks that the contract was not signed by the poor, that they were forced into this situation out of hunger, because he thinks the state is not there to protect common good, but rather to protect property, he's also against wage labor, because he thinks that the workers should control the means of production, that we shouldn't be receiving a salary for our work, but rather we should receive the full amount as a community of what we produce, and that everything we produce should stay within the community. So this means it's not necessarily going into our pocket all of what we make, because we need to support the rest of the community as well, but it mostly means that the most of what we produce is not taken by the owner of private property. So for Kropotkin, no wage labor and control of the means of production by the workers. He's very, very much against what we call laissez-faire capitalism, which is this thing that John Locke loved so much, the capacity of capitalists to do whatever they want with the environment, with our salaries, with our working hours, with the economy in general, with engaging in wars in order to further capitalist enterprise. All of this stuff that nowadays there's debates between Democrats and Republicans as to how much can you control what they call the economy, and we call political economy the ownership of the means of productions and the ability that gives you to control the whole state. All of that Locke thought should be completely free. Kropotkin thinks that the freer capitalism is, the less freedom there is for the workers, because capitalists are very powerful, and when they have freedom to do whatever they want with the economy, usually this turns against the workers that are exploited by these owners of means of production, owners of private property. So, as I said, Kropotkin is a little later writing all this stuff than Marx did, and obviously Kropotkin is very much aware of Marxism and Marx. These were the two biggest tendencies at this moment in the leftists, in the left-leaning, in the most militant world. And there are many differences that need to be determined because they will be helpful for you to be able to understand how different leftism can be and why there have been so deep and antagonistic fights between Marxists and anarchists, especially in the Soviet Union in the 1900s and in Spain a little later on in the 30s. So the differences with Marx, again, is a focus on free distribution of goods and services to cover needs rather than trying to determine individual contributions. Marx thinks that we should be compensated through the state for our labor, but he does envision that there would be differential payments according to the job that needs to be done. It doesn't necessarily mean that the most interesting job will be the best paid. In some communities that followed Marx's ideals, people who picked up the garbage, for example, had better living quarters than those that did better jobs. In other communities, and Marx would have been very interested in developing this, people did different kinds of jobs and alternated jobs. But there was always in Marxism a certain idea that we should compensate the work, even if it's a communist state. Work should be compensated individually, and people would have a certain income that they would have to manage on their own. On the other hand, Kropotkin thinks that there should be a warehouse where you go and find what you need. And this warehouse can take different forms. It doesn't necessarily be just clothing or appliances, but it could also be that the community decides to support you to go to college, for example, if there's a possibility of doing something like that. So Kropotkin thinks that we should all get what we need, and that would be the end of exploitation. So he talks about what socially necessary labor is, and this is something that Marxists also think a lot about. Socially necessary labor is the time that takes people in general to make something. So let's say I take 10 hours to make a chair, but most other people take 6 hours to make a chair. So my clumsiness that results in the 10 hours needed is not socially necessary labor. That's my clumsiness. Socially necessary labor are the 5 to 6 hours that would take somebody else to make that chair. And that's what Marx thinks is the unit through which we exchange goods. How many hours of specialized labor and use of machinery, etc., it takes to make a certain product. That's the basis of how we can estimate how to exchange goods in the market. But Kropotkin says that, of course, socially necessary labor is something that's there, but that it shouldn't or cannot be commodified. It cannot be turned into money. Because if we do that, then we set again in motion the capitalist greed that moves the economy. And instead, what we need to put into place is human needs and cater to human needs. And human needs are more connected with cooperation than class struggle. And this is a huge point of difference with Marx. Marxists think that what made the world progress towards exploitation of nature, harnessing of energy of nature, being closer to working less hours in order to support ourselves, etc., all that came through the classes that had been fighting against each other since the beginning of time. So we moved out of slavery because the feudal lords were fighting with other members of society, other kinds of groups that did not profit as much from serfdom as the lords did. So the lords prevail, and we move from Roman Empire style slavery to many different formations within Europe, where people are able to access land and exploit serfs into working for them. That changes around the time of the revolutions in England and in France, when the new class that starts forming in the cities, the capitalists, the bourgeois. Bourgeois comes from city in Latin. The bourgeois start growing in numbers and start amassing capital at the same time that the feudal lords start losing money and losing power and losing property. And as this class grows up, they want to take over power and displace the old regime that is stopping them from increasing their profits. So Marx, who was Eurocentric and sees that there's progress in harnessing nature, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, etc., sees this class struggle as progress, and he thinks that the working class now has to fight the capitalists in order to reappropriate all this capital that was taken away from the colonial subjects in the global south and from the workers in factories in Europe, and start distributing that wealth in a more egalitarian way that will stop the self-destructive nature of capitalism. But Kropotkin says that this is not true, that society doesn't advance in that way, that the way that society advances is by people cooperating with each other in an egalitarian manner. And he uses the example of the ants like the little insects that build empires underground, to show that it's through this cooperation that communities become strong. So other big differences with Marxism and anarchism is that we are not quite sure what Marx envisioned as a society once the workers took over the bourgeois, the capitalist state. Marx didn't write about that. Marx was very interested in writing about the conditions of the present that would allow to change the future. But he was not into doing science fiction, as we would say nowadays, trying to imagine what the future would be like once the workers took over the state. So we don't know exactly if he wanted a society like the Soviet Union, where there was a very strong dictatorship of the working class, or if he wanted a different kind of society. We are not sure about that. But what we do know, because Kropotkin was very clear about that, was that Kropotkin thought that the world should be functioning better if we were able to split up in small communities that control the means of production, the factory, the producing land, etc., in a collective way. So for anarchists, small communities united under federations of friendly communities are the way to go. While for Marxism, at the time that Marx is writing, it's a little unclear where he wants to take us. Again, Kropotkin thought that humankind was by nature into cooperation and mutual support, while Marx claimed that human nature did not exist, that we humans are just a product of our environment, and that includes our family of origin, our class, social class. Do we own the means of production? Do we work for those who own the means of production? The kind of environment that you were allotted when you were born. Was it cold? Was it hot? Was it very difficult to make a living? All of that, were you born in poverty or whatever, all of that creates an individual that is actually part of a mass of proletariats. He doesn't believe in individuals under capitalism. While Kropotkin thinks that we are good by nature, and it's a system that we are thrown into that spoils us and turns us evil or greedy or cold by nature. So Marx seeks a new human. He wants to create a system, communism, that will allow for the creation, the emergence of a new human. While Kropotkin thinks all we need to do is remove the government and the human is already there and is always good by nature. So what happened after Kropotkin with anarchism? Here in the United States, anarchism was very, very important, and the reason why we have an 8-hour workday and we don't talk about all the anarchists that were hanged in Chicago was part of the struggle of the anarchists. The anarchists really wanted to have an 8-hour workday, 8 hours for organizing and 8 hours for sleeping. This was the way that they envisioned the world, and they gave a very, very hard struggle here in the United States to get that done. And it's because of them that we today have the weekday, we have the weekend, and we have 8 hours of work. Otherwise, if it hadn't been for those struggles of the 1800s, would probably still be working 12 hours, 16 hours a week with no control by the state. Also in the 80s, Lucy Parsons and Lizzie Holmes published a book called Freedom, a Revolutionary Anarchist Communist Monthly. These women were friends of Emma Goldman, another prominent anarchist in the 80s, who was kicked out of the country, like many of them were, by the right-wing forces that were in the state at the time. Emma Goldman was exiled to Poland, I believe, although she didn't even speak the language because she had moved, her parents had brought her here when she was a baby. So again, the Haymarket riots, this was on May 1st. The Haymarket riots signaled the struggle for an 8-hour a weekday. And we don't talk about that here in the United States much, but May 1st is celebrated around the world as a day of rioting or organizing against the state by the workers. In some countries, the protests on May 1st were so many that there are many governments, like in Argentina, for example, that declared a holiday. In that way, they avoid the strikes and they avoid the rallies that used to happen in May 1st. They happen other days, but not on May 1st. Also strongly influenced by the anarchists was the International Workers of the World Association, a very important union organization here in the United States that has resurfaced in this past few decades, and the IWW is still an organization for radical union organizing. Other issues connected with anarchism that are prominent, and many times we don't know they are connected with anarchism, were in 1930s in Spain. There was a civil war that almost ended with Spain becoming some kind of either anarchist or communist country. This war failed in part because of the attacks of the Soviet Union at that time in the hands of Stalin on the anarchists that were resisting in Spain. I think we will talk about the Spanish Revolution in this course, if we have enough time. Also very much influenced by the anarchists in the United States was the New Left in the 60s, the punk rockers and anti-racist organizers of the 80s, also here in the United States. And in 94 and on until 2003, more or less, I believe, we had a very strong movement here that was called the anti-corporate globalization movement or the global justice movement, through which the Black Bloc, who were anarchist organizers that now have morphed into the Antifas, these folks that fight the fascists, especially in the West Coast on the streets. This global justice movement was very much influenced by anarchist organizing. If you looked at the style of organizing of Occupy, was also very much influenced by the anarchists in the sense that they operated through small groups that reached consensus rather than compete over who was right, and organize massive direct actions and communities where people lived in egalitarian ways here in the US that are still together in many cases. These people, the global justice movement, and later the Occupy movement, are generated sort of in Mexico by the Zapatistas when they do a call that calls on people from all over the world who want to organize from the left and from the bottom up. That is to say, it's not a Marxist kind of organizing with a very clear direction of where the movement should go, but rather a movement that's built through consensus and radical organizing. So there are many, many aspects of anarchism that we can see today in the world. Radical ecology, social ecology, anarcho-militant feminism, black and queer liberation movements, anti-neoliberal internationalism, which is also Zapatista inspired. And I mentioned earlier the IWW, the International Workers of the World. If you recall Heather Hayes, who was killed a little bit over a year ago in Charlottesville by the fascists who ran a car into the crowd that was dispersing after the rally, Heather Hayes was a member of the IWW and an anarchist in her own right. So that's more or less like a very, very fast panorama of what anarchism was and is, and especially focusing on the figure of Kropotkin with the notion of anarcho-communism, which is a little different from other ways of thinking of anarchism that we will see in the future and that you might run into on your own. Well, and I think that's going to be the lecture for today. I'll try and share it through our website.